So I'll drop my email in there, and I'm going to turn it over to Jay Godmore with the Manuscript Society to tell you a little bit more about our program tonight, our speaker, and a little bit about the Manuscript Society.
Hey,
Thanks.
welcome everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. So today is February 3rd. It's the February session of the Manuscript Society's Manuscript Mondays. The mission of the Manuscript Society is to encourage the collection and preservation of manuscripts and documents to stimulate and aid collectors in the various collecting specialties to facilitate the exchange of information and knowledge among collectors, scholars, dealers, and the general public, and to promote the highest professional and ethical standards. The Manuscript Society was founded in 1948 and now not just includes collectors, but also curators, librarians, dealers, auction houses, and has members from Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, and South America. It publishes a quarterly journal. Excuse me, I'm having trouble speaking. On manuscripts and a quarterly newsletter, the Manuscript Society News. Um, has a scholarship program. The Richard Moss Research Grant is currently accepting applications until February 14th. For more information, go to our website. And without further ado, let's go to Dr. Jason Silverman. Um, Jason, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first of all, Jay, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very, very excited to be here tonight. I I was a professor of history for over 40 years, and most of that time was spent studying Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War era. I taught at Yale University and then at Winthrop University. The bulk of my career was at Winthrop, some 33 and a half years. It was very interesting that when you invited me to tonight's show, it literally caused me to sit down and think about the experiences that I've had as a researcher and with manuscripts. And so I jotted down some memories and some experiences that I've had, many of which other people might have been able to duplicate, but some I'd be surprised if they had the same experience that I did. Uh, I loved what I was doing. I loved teaching. I loved writing. Um, I loved researching. It was almost like I envisioned myself as a historical Sherlock Holmes, a detective to track down exactly what I needed to find and how I needed to find it. And I'd like to share some of those stories with you tonight, as sort of a reflection on how things have changed and how to research somebody as well known as Abraham Lincoln has in many ways their own problems that if you're not a Lincoln scholar, you never would have thought about. What you might think about is that Lincoln is one of the most popular subjects imaginable. In fact, the Library of Congress at one point, several years ago, said a book on Lincoln was published every 5.5 days. So there were over 16,500 books on Abraham Lincoln. And I'd like to share some stories about that with you tonight as well. So, I mean, look at me as a retired historical Sherlock Holmes now, who is reflecting on his career with and without a Dr. Watson. I think I'd like to start really with perhaps one of the more amusing stories. And there's no better place to begin than the beginning. As a graduate student, I chose a topic for my doctoral dissertation, which necessitated me going to Canada. As a graduate student, also, uh, you're on a shoestring budget. That's what you are. You are absolutely counting every penny's known to man. And that's how I went up there as a graduate student, researching at some minor places and some major places like the Public Archives of Canada or the Ontario Provincial Archives. Now, I must admit that on one level, at the very beginning, I was spoiled because in those days, those two major libraries allowed you, now I don't know if it's the same anymore, but they allowed you to check out a little bit of material to a locker, which they kept track of, and you could work until whenever you wanted to. I mean, they had security guards there. So I was very excited about that because it meant I could spend fewer nights in a motel, which I couldn't afford to start off with. The problem is, I don't think they informed the security guards because when I was ready to go, I found myself locked in to the Ontario Provincial Archives. And I must confess, I was tired of working that day. I did not look at it as a good luck event. Quite the contrary. In fact, I was a little bit concerned that I was going to have to stay there all night long. And as a result, they'd find me weeks later, malnourished and dehydrated. Fortunately, within an hour, hour and a half, the security guard came and he apologized profusely for locking me in. I was the only one there that night. And we became relatively decent friends. And so he always made sure that I wasn't locked in. Now, you might think the story would end there because I did my research, I came back and I wrote my dissertation. But the Canadian government was extremely interested in my topic, which dealt with fugitive slaves in Canada. And so consequently, I applied for a Canadian government grant to go back to Canada and do the work of revising the dissertation into what became my first book. But this time I wasn't a poor graduate student. I was very, very fortunate to have started my career at Yale University. And so for applying for a grant from Yale, which had a fledgling Canadian studies program, the Canadian government was extremely generous, extremely. And so when I went back, I was anything but a poor graduate student who had to rely on eating whatever he could get out of a vending machine. I had a very nice hotel, very comfortable, and I was able to spend money on decent meals. So I was sort of basking in the glory of all of this. And as a young man, I think I was probably 28 years old, 29 years old at the time. I must confess that it went to my head a little bit, and I became somewhat egotistical about here I am in Canada at the beginning of my career, and the world is mine. So I had a meeting. I had a meeting at the government house in Ottawa, and I was staying in a very nice hotel. I get on the elevator to go down. I think it was a block or two away from the hotel. I get down to the elevator, and these two kind of what is a good word to describe them? They were not particularly well dressed, and they seemed to be out of place. Let's just put it that way. They got on the elevator with me, and we rode down. We didn't chat at all, but they were lost in their own world. We get off the elevator, and there is this gigantic limousine in front of the hotel. And I think for a moment, holy cow, man, this really is treating me royally. Now, mind you, the ego was inflating exponentially with each step that I take towards the limousine. But these two kind of interesting characters. They walk past me, they go through the front door, and they get in the limousine and they drive off. And I thought, wait a second, that's my limousine. What in the world are they doing? So the doorman said to me, as I must have looked incredulous, do you know who those two were? And I said, obviously not. They were the singing group Hall and Oates, who were in Ottawa to give a concert. And so, of course, the concert was sold out and the limousine was for them. And I had to walk the 4 blocks or whatever to the government center, which, of course, placed it all in perspective for me because I wasn't on top of the world. The limousine wasn't for me. And it was a very short lived flirtation with being treated royally. And to this day, which is what, 45 years later, I can't listen to a Hall and Oates song on the radio or on a CD or wherever on Sirius XM or Alexa or whatever without thinking those two guys stole my limousine that day. So there it was, the graduate student poverty and the inflated ego of a first year faculty member who thought that the Canadian government was his for the asking. From that point on, Jay, I had a better perspective about researching and what to expect. But I can tell you this, Jay, that if you want to feel old instantaneously, walk into a classroom and try to describe writing your thesis, master's thesis, or your doctoral dissertation on a typewriter to a group of students who were not even born in the same century as you. This is the digital age to them. And so they have no idea what it was like to do research the old fashioned way. And my master's thesis was done at the Colorado Historical Society, where literally, I went through census after census, marking stick figures because my master's thesis was on Confederate activity in Colorado Territory during the Civil War. There was no digitization. There was no census that had been compiled. It was all me. And I've already told you about my dissertation, also done on a typewriter, in which I was literally holding manuscripts in my hands that spoke to the Fugitive Slave Committee in Canada West, it was called, but we know it as Ontario. So it was a very interesting and informative learning curve for me, especially since towards the end of my career at Winthrop before I retired, all of those kids were in the digital age, absolutely the digital age, and had no idea. Maybe they knew what a typewriter was, but they certainly could not foresee writing a paper on that or researching in the library anything that had not been digitized that they could see on their computer at home.
That's a good point, Jason. Tell us about how research has changed from
Well,
when you started to now.
that's a good question, Jay. I was not a big fan of digitization, really. Um, Sort of old school in terms of going to the library, going to the archives, going to a repository, and seeing the manuscript, seeing the document, holding it in my hand. That's to me the essence of research. That to me was what a historian does. In 2010, one of my graduate students who was writing her master's thesis under me was a beginning teacher in high school, and she was busy all day long, and she extolled the virtues of researching online. Now, even then in 2010, I knew that you can do certain things online, but I could never be convinced that you could do everything online. But she was a very convincing young woman. And she basically said, Dr. Silverman, if I could write this whole master's thesis online, uh, would you accept it? And I said, well, whatever you do online, uh, if I see some things that you didn't do that I think you should do, then you're going to have to go to the library. So we agreed on this. And the long story short there is that I would say 80% of her research was done online. She had done a master's thesis on new arrivals at Ellis Island. And even in 2010, all of those records had been digitized. But when I looked at her footnotes and her bibliography, I found some omissions that I thought she had to consult, particularly in books, in secondary sources, to get an interpretive framework for what she was doing. Did she indeed read the oral histories of arrivals at Ellis Island? Yes. Did she have a proper interpretive framework? No. So consequently, she she did it reluctantly, but she had to go to library or go up to the nearest major repository, which was either the University of South Carolina in Columbia or a little further, Chapel Hill in North Carolina. So that was kind of my framework of 2010 of how research has changed. What sort of pushed me over the edge, however, in terms of accepting digitization was the COVID era. Because here I am at home wanting to write about Abraham Lincoln, and I'm retired, so I've got plenty of time to write. And I always imagined myself a very prolific and productive scholar. And I had already, I think, at this point, produced before 2020 one book that was sort of an offshoot of one of my major studies, which was Abraham Lincoln and the Immigrant. But I decided, because I'm a former athlete myself, I wanted to write about Abraham Lincoln, the athlete. Many people know that he was a wrestler, but long story short is what I found online. Now, there were a number of things that I was able to access from this room where I'm sitting in right now that surprised me. And with minor exceptions of writing to archivists and librarians and curators who helped me despite the COVID era, I was able to compose and complete Abraham Lincoln, the athlete, predominantly online. So I'd have to say that was the watershed moment for me. I became a true believer then, Jay, that it can be done. Can it be completely done? No, I still don't accept that. I understand that research has changed and people now are able to access things digitally that they could never have before. But to me, a manuscript will always be something I hold in my hands as I'm sitting in an uncomfortable chair in an archives, repository, or library with a tiny little pencil in my hand taking notes. The next book was a Lincoln and the Railroad, and that too was something that I was able to achieve significantly online, but still not completely. Again, I think anybody who believes they could produce a scholarship is sorely mistaken if they think they can do it online without the help of people like all of the researchers and archivists who are so splendidly helpful to folks like me who don't travel as much as I would have as a younger man. So that's how research has changed, Jay. It's changed to the extent that instead of sitting in an uncomfortable chair and literally going to the National Archives, the Library of Congress, you do it in the quiet, comfortable confines of your house. But I still don't think that you can do it completely. A manuscript is a manuscript. And I know my students would argue with me, and my graduate students would argue with me that I'm old-fashioned, that I'm stuck in my ways in terms of definitions of things, and perhaps I am. But a primary source is a primary source, and it's such because it's housed in a library. You might be able to read it, but you also have to take into consideration that there are mistakes in digitization. I found some, as a matter of fact. I found some and corresponded with some very, very helpful people who were grateful that I thought, they weren't major mistakes. But if you're going to quote something, you need to quote it accurately. And so if it's a word here or a word there, it's something that you need to be careful about. And there's a very famous meme that I loved. I had it up on the wall of my office. It was a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And the quote was, "Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean you have to believe it." And I thought, yeah, that's Abe. That's Abe. Now, Lincoln was a very interesting person to research all of the years that I worked on Abraham Lincoln, in large part because of who he was and what he did. You don't think of Abraham Lincoln as a person who was difficult to research. There were two prevailing notions every time I set out to research Lincoln. Number one was my own standard that I established. And number two was the standard that Lincoln himself established. My standard was that I had very little patience for books written on Abraham Lincoln that just simply said the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, how many books can there be about the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment or his inaugural addresses or any of those things for that matter? And they're not always new. I mean, some reviewers praise to the mountaintop that so and so wrote a brand new book on Abraham Lincoln on a well-trodden subject, but basically shone new light on an old topic. I never found that to be such. I basically found minimal significance in topics that had been beaten to the ground. So the standard that I applied is I always wanted to find something about Abraham Lincoln that had never been written before. The first book that I did was first book on Lincoln of this ilk was Lincoln and the Immigrant, which was published in 2015. And I followed that up with When America Welcomed Immigrants, which was about something that nobody had ever written about before. And that was Abraham Lincoln's act to encourage emancipation, the first, last, and only act a president ever encouraged and signed that encouraged immigration to come to the United States. Neither of those topics had ever been covered before. And then there was Lincoln the Athlete. There were bits and pieces of all of that scattered, but nobody ever wrote a book about his love of baseball, which was called Town Ball, racquetball, which was called Fives. He played billiards. He of course he wrestled. He did all sorts of sports. This book was the first one that I know of that compiled everything. The railroad book, I will freely admit, that had been done before. When I started it, the last time it had been written was 100 years earlier. So that was my standard. The second standard that Lincoln applied, which made it difficult, was this is a guy who was, I just want to read you these two quotes. These are from two people who knew him very, very well. His last law partner, William Herndon, said, Abraham Lincoln is the most shut-mouthed man who ever lived, unquote. A friend of his who he appointed to the Supreme Court ultimately was Judge David Davis, who said, I know the man so well. He was the most reticent, secretive man I ever saw or expect to see. So Lincoln had no journal. He didn't do a diary. He didn't do any kind of massive record that presidents leave behind. So you had to dig and dig and dig to try and find out what the true Lincoln thought, what Lincoln truly thought about things. And it was only really relatively recently in history that it came to the light of day what has been classified as the Lincoln fragments. Lincoln, he drove his personal secretaries nuts. He would write something down, particularly if he was angry at somebody. He would write down an angry response, put it in a desk drawer, and it's a good lesson for all of us. Believe me, I've learned the hard way. You don't fire something off without thinking about it. But Lincoln would put it in a desk drawer and it would stay there. It would just stay there and he would forget about it and nobody even knew where it was or what it was. When he died, when he was assassinated, one of his personal secretaries, a man by the name of John Hay, found the little pieces of paper everywhere when they were cleaning out the White House for Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson. So far, 111 of these fragments have been recovered. And a very prestigious Lincoln scholar by the name of Ronald White wrote a book in about 3-4 years ago called Lincoln in Private, which took these scraps of paper that had been discovered and basically wove them into what was actually kind of a new perspective on Lincoln on the basis of these things that Lincoln never planned on having seen the light of day. Ronald White was able to access this because as John Hay assembled all of this in the aftermath of Lincoln's death, he and Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's son, became the caretaker of these papers to make certain that they did not filter out any earlier than they needed to be. So the standard that Lincoln himself established was he was no easy mark to figure out what was on his mind. You think that you figured him out, and then you find something that really hasn't been used, and it says kind of the opposite. He made it very, very difficult to find out the real Lincoln, and to this day, studying him for almost 40 years and 15 books later, I still don't know the real Lincoln. If you want to know the truth, I think I know him reasonably well, and I still think he was the greatest president this country has ever seen or will ever see. And I also think he was an incredible human being, an absolutely compassionate, humane, forgiving human being. But there are aspects to his being that I still have difficulty with, in large part because of the fact that, at the bottom line, much as I hate to admit this, Lincoln was a politician. He was pragmatic. That's what he was. And he did what he had to do to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. Now, fortunately for all of us, he accomplished quite a bit. But until I started snooping around, nobody had ever written about his act to encourage immigration, which, you see, you ask people, they'll say, well, the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment or his inaugural addresses, the Gettysburg Address. These are the things that Lincoln should be remembered for. Well, maybe, but his act to encourage immigration on July 4th, fittingly, 1864, is a far cry from what has existed in American history in regard to our treatment and reception of American immigrants. But you wouldn't have found that in any book before I wrote mine. So there are still new things to find out about this man.
Where are the fragments you mentioned? Where are they located now?
A number of them are located at the Library of Congress, and a number of them are located at the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum in Springfield.
Do you find that because he's Lincoln that there's more online about him?
Yes, yes, I think you're absolutely right, Jay, because the standard reference work for someone like me coming up in the profession was I believe it's about 12 volumes, the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, edited by Roy Bassler. That was the standard tool for those of us who wanted to read letters to Lincoln or letters from Lincoln. But the Abraham Lincoln Papers Project in Springfield, associated with the Lincoln Library and Museum, they set out on a very, very noble quest to try and obtain, at the very least, copies, if not the originals, of all letters, papers, anything that pertained to or was about Abraham Lincoln. And over the years, they've spawned a couple projects. The Abraham Lincoln legal papers, same thing, trying to obtain the legal documents of Lincoln's career. But rather than producing one volume after another volume, Jay, in published form, they are in the process of digitizing everything. So you can go online to the Abraham Lincoln Papers Project, and it has a very, very nice search mechanism. And I will tell you, for example, this was years ago, but I had read about the project, and I might have been a young assistant professor at the time, or maybe not. I've lost track of when I did this, but I was just kind of fooling around, and so I went to the website and I put in the search term Silverman, just to see if Abraham Lincoln had ever mentioned anybody that he met by the name of Silverman. And sure enough, there was one Silverman in there who was a merchant that Lincoln had written a pass for to travel into the border state, if I'm not mistaken, Kentucky, which would have been, in essence, maybe not literally, but figuratively crossing into what could have been considered Confederate territory. But that's when I became convinced that, whenever I had research to do, or a name, specifically a name of somebody that I wanted to find more about, there it was online in the Lincoln Papers Project. They're not done with it by any stretch of the imagination, and they've been very successful too, because obviously they want the original copies, and in some instances they have been gifted those, but in many other instances the owner of the document just made a copy and sent it to them, and they accepted that gracefully as well. So yes, because he's Abraham Lincoln, I think you could find a lot more digitally than you can perhaps about some of his predecessors as president, or successors for that matter.
What are your thoughts on the Bixby letter? Is it real? Has there been any additional research about it?
I'm sorry, what is my opinion
The
about what?
Bixby letter, the one that was in Saving
Oh,
Private Ryan?
yeah, I think that's been sort of disputed as being a genuine. There have been several articles written, not recently either for that matter, many, many years ago, that started to refute it in terms of being as accurate as some historians believed. And now I think if you're asking a Lincoln historian in 2025, is the Bixby letter legit, they might take that with a grain of salt. But there are a lot of myths that surround Lincoln. Um, People seem to be fascinated with his love life and the women that preceded Mary Todd. Some of that has been disputed as well. So it's I guess the epitome of this is, I remember in high school, when I was in high school, I was given I don't even remember who gave it to me, but it was a penny, a Lincoln penny, that somebody had come up with an ingenious way of making a buck off of it, with an engraved, tiny little engraved portrait of John Kennedy. And it was attached to a postcard that had a list of all of these coincidences between John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln. And boy, was I fascinated with that. I thought, oh my God, this gives me goosebumps. Well, slowly but surely over the years, one by one, they have either been qualified or actually disputed as being inaccurate. So when you've got somebody who's as written about as much as Abraham Lincoln, I think it's inevitable that you're going to find a whole bunch of myths surrounding him and a whole bunch of half truths. Now, also, of course, you always got to keep in mind what my professor of historiography told us in graduate school. The historian's cross that he has to bear and be aware of, presentism. So, and it doesn't just pertain to Lincoln, but it's been in the news a lot. Presentism is evaluating a historical character on the basis of your present time in life, not theirs. So if you evaluate Abraham Lincoln by today's standards, well, I'm sure most of the people listening have come across at least a story or two in which Abraham Lincoln has been accused of being a racist, or the treatment of the American Indians in Minnesota, or Wisconsin. All of these things are unfair about Lincoln, or any person for that matter, if they're not evaluated in the basis of their own time. Jefferson, another case. In his time, he was a liberal, an absolute liberal, but he's come under an enormous amount of criticism in recent years, reflecting on what was considered to be his unenlightened attitude towards slavery. Same with Lincoln. So I think that whoever you're talking about, and whenever you're talking about them, you've always got to be aware of the fact who is saying what and when it was said. You know, Lincoln is my man, so obviously I'm more familiar with that than others. But when I was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, you didn't even think twice about criticizing Thomas Jefferson. Not there, not at UVA. And if you did, you got kind of looked at strange, because his premier biographer at that time was a man by the name of Dumas Malone, who I think had already written 4 of the 5 volumes. And Malone had an office in the history building that bespoke to his prestige as Jefferson biographer. I doubt seriously if a Jefferson biographer at the University of Virginia today would be accorded the same kind of acceptance if all he said were good things about Thomas Jefferson, the same way Abraham Lincoln is. So I've tried in my books to at least be objective about Abraham Lincoln and some of the things he did or didn't do.
Dr. Silverman, I'm going to ask you one more question, but if anybody
Okay.
has questions, please put them in the Q&A section. Of all the books you've written, which one's your favorite? To research, to write, just in general.
Well, this is gonna probably be a surprise. I should have sent a picture along with my answer to this. I have been fortunate that lightning has struck twice in my career in terms of allowing me to see uh, documents, literally primary documents, hold them in my hand that no historian had ever seen before. The first one was when I was in Colorado working on my master's degree, and I frequented a used bookstore, got to know the owner, who was a really interesting character, who asked me if I what I was interested in. And I told him, and he said, "Well, I've got here. This is the Civil War diary of my great 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 uncle. Would you like to transcribe it?" So I said, "Yeah." So I spent a summer transcribing it. He would not let me take it out of the store, but he scared the heck out of me on an ongoing basis because he kept the diary on his desk as he smoked cigars and put the cigar in an ashtray very close to the diary. And I thought, my God, I'm going to come in here one day and the store and the diary would be absolutely burned to the ground. But I took that diary, and actually it led me to Manuscripts, the journal. I turned it into a scholarly article in 1977, and a delightful editor of Manuscripts Journal, a man by the name of Ormond Kay, treated this fledgling graduate student with kid gloves. And it was, at that point, the major moment in my life to have uh, a scholarly article in a prestigious journal. But that was just a journal. Lightning struck twice when, and this answers your question, Jay, about my favorite book. Um, One of my graduate students was doing his master's thesis. He worked at the York, South Carolina Historical Society, and he was working on the diary of a young soldier by the name of DJ Logan. The long story short is Logan was in a South Carolina unit called the Tramp Brigade, which went from one theater of war to another. It was very unusual that they'd go west or east. Well, he asked me if I could take his master's thesis and help him turn it into a book, which I did. And the book was very well received. It was A Rising Star of Promise. I should have sent a picture of that one too. Rising Star of Promise. The commanding officer was a general by the name of Nathan Shanks Evans. And Shanks was his nickname because he had real spindly legs. And I became intrigued that nothing had ever been written about Evans before, and yet he was an incredibly colorful person. He had been court-martialed twice, had sought his superior officers to be court-martialed. He went into battle with something that he called the barrelito, which was a barrel of alcohol that he drank regularly. So I thought, why isn't there a biography of this guy? So I looked at biographical indexes and biographical encyclopedias, and it would always mention there are no primary documents available on Evans. So this is when Sherlock Holmes Silverman clicked into work. I did some of the, oh, there you go. There's the picture of that. And the other one is called Shanks. Shanks. So I did some detective work. I tracked down a relative, a descendant who had graduated from Duke University in the 1940s, tracked down his descendants to a town in Florida, contacted him and said, I want to write a biography of your ancestor, but this is what it says. And he told me that he had the general's footlocker that was packed with the general's papers. Well, you want to talk about being excited. So eventually I got to see, touch, and hold all of these papers in the general's footlocker. His descendant was very protective of his ancestor, and he insisted that I give him first right of refusal on my manuscript. And I said, no, I'll let you read it before I submit it to a publisher, but I'm going to be fair, and I will let you read it to prove to you that I am going to be fair and objective. It's not going to be a hatchet job. It's going to be the first scholarly account of General Nathan Shanks Evans in many of his own words. Well, eventually, with a little persuasion and a little charm, he relented. I don't think he was ever happy. I sent him a number of the copies of the book when I got my author's copies, and never heard word one from him again. But that would have to be my favorite book, given the detective work that that I had to do to produce it. Now, outside of that, then Lincoln and the Immigrant would be my favorite book that I've ever done on Lincoln. And I think there it is. There's Shanks. Now, does he not look like an intimidating kind of guy? I think he looks spooky. But I think those would be my favorite books, Jay.
Thanks, Dr. Silverman. What can you tell us about Lincoln and Darwin, Charles Darwin?
Well, they were both born on the same day. I don't think they had a significant correspondence or relationship, although there have been a couple creative studies, twin biographies, I guess, of the two of them. I will say this, that few presidents had as keen of a scientific interest as Lincoln did. Lincoln is the only president in American history with a patent, and the patent was to make sailing along the Sangamon River a lot easier because boats, barges, got stuck in the sand. So whatever Lincoln could have known about Darwin, I think Lincoln would have known about what Darwin said if he had access to it, and I think he would have been very impressed with Charles Darwin, because Lincoln had for somebody who was so poorly educated school wise, Lincoln had an incredible mind, an absolute incredible mind. And obviously, I think it's relatively well known, the fact that he could manufacture out of his mind quotes from Shakespeare and Donne and anybody that he had read, anybody whose works Lincoln had read, the Bible. He knew the Bible inside and out, even though he wasn't a religious man. But he read it because when he was young, he consumed any book he could get his hand on. So without any definitive proof that Lincoln said, oh, I think Darwin is the greatest scientist of our age or something along those lines, I think Lincoln would have been very impressed with Darwin.
What's the biggest discovery you think you've made in your research, and it doesn't have to be Lincoln?
I guess it would be the biography of Shanks, because I took all of those biographical entries that said no primary documents exist as a challenge, and so I think that tracking that down, that might have been the greatest piece of detective work I ever did. But it also kind of spoiled me into thinking that if lightning could strike twice, then it could strike 3 times, 4 times, or 5 times, which it hasn't done. I've not found any mother lode of Lincoln documents that in essence would rival that. Although, to answer your question on a secondary note, Jay, writing about Lincoln, I found an incredible value in county histories, in Lincoln's Illinois and Lincoln's time. I said, when is a manuscript not a manuscript? Well, these were published volumes. I mean, they're not digitized. Some of them are digitized on Internet Archives, if that's digitization. But to learn about Lincoln, in essence, through these county histories, or personal reminiscences of his friends or people who knew him, I learned an awful lot about Abraham Lincoln's personality. I had never had any idea that he was an incredible handball player, and that he would sneak out of the law office and leave Herndon in charge while he went to the alley and played handball with a group of people that he played with regularly, or that he was a town ball, an absolute fanatic when it came to town ball. He loved to play baseball with kids if need be, but some of the adults. All of these things came, these tidbits that I was able to turn into Lincoln the Athlete, came from county histories and personal reminiscences that detective work led me to. I don't think many scholars avail themselves of those sources too frequently. In large part, maybe because they concluded that it wouldn't be objective. It wouldn't be unbiased if somebody was writing about Lincoln in these ways, because everybody late in life, everybody claimed to know Lincoln very, very well, and that's not the truth. So I had to verify whether the authors of these county histories or personal reminiscences literally knew Lincoln, or thought they knew Lincoln, or very, very late in their life convinced themselves they knew Lincoln. But those were all manuscripts to me. I mean, a purist might say, no, if it's been published, it's a secondary source. Well, I'll let them have their opinion. My opinion is the things that I used were manuscripts.
Does anybody else have any questions for Dr. Silverman? Well, I've got one more.
Okay.
I didn't mention that you're the new executive director of the Manuscript Society. Tell us why you're so excited about your new position.
That's an excellent question, Jake. I really believe in serendipity. And I've told you already, and your listeners, that manuscripts, the journal, the scholarly journal, got me started on my way. So, having completed 4 books in the 7 years since I've been retired, I thought, my back, my hand, and my legs can't take the endless working on a book all day, every day that I had for all of my retirement. So I thought I need to find something to keep busy, because I really do need to keep busy. I think that's the key to success in retirement. And so as I'm kind of surfing the internet, I thought, I wonder what Manuscripts is up to. And sure enough, there was the ad. And I thought, well, I think I'm going to apply for this. I've got a soft spot in my heart for the Manuscript Society. As my family will attest to, I love collecting. I've got several collections of which I'm very, very proud of. Why not apply? And if I get it, then it was meant to be. If I don't get it, well, it wasn't meant to be. And every step along the way, whoever I dealt with, whether it was my predecessor and my mentor, Shirley Sands, is a godsend, or the members of the board of trustees, either individually or in the executive committee, all of the interviews were with these incredibly nice, welcoming, professional and intelligent people. And I thought, you know what? I think I really want this job. I think I really do. I think I could do a good job. And I think this is where I belong. I think I was led serendipitously to the ad. And so there you go. I'm honored and humbled to be named executive director of the Manuscript Society. And I think at this time in my life, it was meant to be. And I never would have met you, Jay, if I didn't get the job.
Yes. And one final question.
Yes, sir.
Are you a bigger Lincoln fan or a bigger baseball fan? That's from Brad Cook, editor of the Manuscripts.
Oh my goodness gracious. Brad, boy, that might be the toughest question of the entire evening. Because as somebody growing up in Alexandria, I was a Washington Senators and now a Washington Nationals fan, and they have the presidential race at every game.
You have to pick.
I would have to say, because I've been a Washington Senators fan since I was a Cub Scout, I'd have to go with baseball.
Great.
With all due respect to Abe, and I hope he forgives me.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Silverman. Wonderful presentation. And stay tuned for next month information on next month's Manuscript Monday. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you, Jay, so much. Thank you, Lee. You guys are wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
And you'll see, you can find the archive of the past events on manuscriptsociety.org and learn more about what's coming up. That's where you'll find the calendar, where you can find our next event for next month. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening and enjoy your month.
Thank you so much, you guys. I really had a good time.